we were going to try and make this quite a disruptive event, and I still want to make that happen. But one of the disruptions we had planned has been disrupted by Apple Store, because we were hoping you'd all have downloaded, or many of you would have downloaded the app for today, and we'd be able to beam you disruptive messages at key points in the day. I'm going to try and replicate the disruptions. I'll have to be the disruption and the non-disruptive mainstream thing that's going on, but I think I can probably manage that. So for the first disruption, some of you just want to sit and digest your lunch, which was very nice. If you're up for moving about a bit and helping the digestion along, as we did right at the start, which was great, can you come into this space down here? So I want, at least sort of, it'd be nice if there were sort of 10 or 12 of you, but not completely packed or the thing won't work. That's great. Okay, and the rest of you, well, we're not going to call you lazy, but you can just be the important onlookers to the event. Okay, so none of you have any idea what's going to go on, and part of what I want to talk about is how we feel about disruption, because our students actually have quite complex feelings about disruption when we ask them to do things that feel unfamiliar. You guys have no, come on, another couple, this will work better with another two. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. Come on, make it 9 or 10. Go on, here, one more, great. Okay, so let's imagine that you're I thought the grass was literally grass, which is how I imagined everyone would be sort of milling about, but let's imagine you're milling about, and you've just had a message from, maybe you think it's from your best friend on your mobile phone, and it's giving you this instruction. I did get it down to 140 characters, so I'll try and remember it. Okay, so part 1. Check out 2 other people who are standing on the grass with you. Don't let them know who you're thinking of, but just have 2 of them in your mind, okay? So have a little look around. Check out 2 of them. You can count to 2 even after lunch, and remember them. You're not going to be just these ones. This is for you guys. Yeah, just 2 people on the grass, and I'm not counted. Okay, so when I ask you to move, you need to start to move. You can do this quite gently. We've got health and safety looking. Move around until you're exactly halfway between the 2 people that you have noticed. You don't need to let them know that you know it's them. You just need to be exactly halfway. And as they move, that's it, you might find you need to move around as well. And, oh, we've got a circle around the edge. Okay, stop. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Now, that was completely pointless exercise. I just thought I'd humiliate a few people before I started. No, that's not so. So, thank you for doing that so willingly. I use that exercise normally with a much larger group of people, and it, you can have people climbing over chairs, and, I was told just now we weren't allowed to do that, so, okay, we kept it on the floor. But it illustrates a few things. I think it illustrates for me how nerve-wracking it is to be in a public space and not know what's going to be asked of you and not know what's going to happen. And it illustrates the fact that the public spaces that we create online and the hybrid spaces we create are troubling spaces. We don't necessarily know if we're on our own in them, having a private experience, if we're relating to 1 or 2 other people, or indeed if our relationship to those other people is suddenly becoming public. And that's the kind of troubling space that we ask our students to occupy all the time. Now, for the rest of this session, I'd like you, please, and contrary to what you may often be told, keep your mobile devices switched on. And we're going to try this. I might even suggest you can have the sound up. I don't know, maybe, well, not if you're going to get lost. No, maybe we won't have the sound up. But keep your mobile devices switched on and enabled, because there's lots of opportunity for me to ask you what you think, and I will be monitoring what you say on the disrupt_learn Twitter stream. So hopefully we can have a bit more of a 2-way interaction. And also, hopefully, I don't know if some of you have been monitoring the tag cloud that I tweeted around this morning, but a lot of other people who aren't here in the room, who might be in other bits of this conference or not here at all, are taking part using that tag. So we might be able to get some dialogue going outside of the room as well. And that's important for the way I teach. It's important for students in the way that they learn when they come into a space to be taught or to encounter learning. I've used this wonderful picture from Phone Our Nation to illustrate that point, because I don't think anyone can give Phone Our Nation too much publicity, but also because I think this image of young people using their mobile phones illustrates a lot of what I'm kind of going to say is students' digital practice, students' digital experience, and how it might be disruptive. So it's disruptive because this space is suddenly borderless, and this space is suddenly borderless. We're inviting people outside the space, and I'm explicitly inviting you to step out of this space and look things up, reference things that I might suggest to you, things that you think of for yourself. So the space has suddenly become porous or leaky or open, and that's what mobile devices allow to happen. It's also the case that these technologies are very personal. was having a conversation with someone this morning about how... No, please come in. We've just done loads of moving around, it's fine. We're comfortable with that in this space. How personal these technologies are, how much they're part of students' being, how likely they are, for example, if they are in a lab or a field situation, just to take out their mobile phone and capture what's going on, the result of an experiment, something interesting they've seen, capture that and then curate it later. And how uncomfortable that might be for academics who think that serious note-taking is the only way, really, for students to capture what's going on. So that kind of personal practices come into the learning space and begin to disrupt it, you know. Why is taking a picture of an experiment any less valid a way of capturing what went on for review later than writing it in your notebook? You know, that's quite challenging for some teachers. And the other thing I want to kind of note is the prevalence of the image. So Graham was talking earlier about how much is changing, how the media we use are changing. But actually, if you look at how we use media to express ideas, the kind of overwhelming change in the last 10 years, and particularly among younger people as compared to older people, is not that they're digital, but they're dominated by the image. And not just the image as a way of communicating what I already know. You know, it's nice to use images at a conference presentation, but as a way of thinking with. I was talking to your newest colleague earlier this morning and saying to him that the British Library's done some research which shows that the majority of people under 19 who arrive at British Library resources do so through an image search. Now, to me, with my text-based education, I can't imagine looking for serious academic content. I can imagine now, because I've sat with students and said, how do you do it? And it's actually really effective. But I couldn't have imagined looking for serious content using an image. But actually, younger people think with images. They don't just communicate what they already know. They actually change the way they think about the world. They actually make serious points through the images that they work with. Google search, just Google image search. They just use a Google search to do that. A lot of this content is not just book-based, so it's their digital content. So to be fair, you know, but I mean, if you know, for example, just this morning when we were listening to the presentation, I knew I wanted an image from Diana Laurel's 2001 book, Rethinking University Teaching, and I wanted, so I searched for the diagram. And that's something that students have taught me. I would never think of that, but I searched for the diagram because when you're scanning a page of results, you can hone in on the diagram that looks the way you know it should look much more quickly than you can hone in on a text-based little clip. So that's the kind of thing. However, I don't want to get hung up on the media. And as Graham said this morning, you know, the technology isn't the disruption. So we can be really disruptive with traditional technologies, with a pen and paper. We can be really disruptive. We can pass notes in class. We can be quite naughty with traditional technologies. And I was going to encourage you just now, if you're using Twitter, if you're ready to tweet something really disruptive right now, okay? I can take it, I really can, and I will at some point come back to the Twitter stream and just see what disruptive things you managed to tweet at this point in time. Okay, so I Googled in a more traditional way, I Googled disruption. And one of the first things that came up was the great disruption of the Church of Scotland. Now, my grandparents were all Church of Scotland missionaries, all four of them. So yeah, don't do any character analysis based on that fact. So I know a little bit about this event, the Great Disruption, and actually, historically, it's really kind of part of the Reformation. So although it happened in the 19th century, the printing of the Bible was kind of having its ramifications even down to the 19th century. The fact that people could access the Word of God as it was in print form was having social, cultural effects. And in the 19th and early 20th century, if you did something important like break away from your mother church or found the futurist movement or encouraged students to riot, then you did it with paper. I mean, I spent quite a lot of my youth fly posting, and those you know, that no longer occurs, I'm quite sure. Nobody gets sticky with buckets of glue anymore. You just use social media. But print was the way you did it. And these I don't know, 140 or so men of the church decided to break away. And to mark the importance of that, they all signed their names on the manifesto. But as they were signing their names on the manifesto, some innovator thought, well, maybe there's another technology that could actually make this event memorable. And 12 photographs were taken of the event at which these documents were signed. And then an artist took the photographs away and made this image as evidence that the event had happened and of the people who'd been there. I guess they couldn't kind of duck out of it later when they went back to their church communities. And this was one of the first uses of photography in Scotland. It was 1845. So people who were disrupting socially were already co-opting new media. Media so new it had hardly ever been used. They were co-opting it for their disruptive purposes. So the point I'm making is that the disruption is a cultural, social disruption, and the new media are getting co-opted for it. This is a wonderful image you can find online called 144 Hours in Kiev from the Ukrainian Revolution last February. And you can see, actually, you can see that there are something like 14,000 images here in this one, but you can see night and day coming along in kind of swathes of darker images. And this is the use of social media in the Arab Spring and the various revolutions of the last couple of years has been well documented and well researched. And it's an example of a fairly well embedded medium. It's not novel, it's not new, having immense kind of social effects. Okay, so this is just to remind you, you can tweet something provocative and disruptive at this point in time if you feel moved to. I've lost my connection. I'll do my best to catch up on those later. Unfortunately, the Twitter stream behind me only shows the top tweets, so I can't keep up with it as we go along. Okay, so the principles that I've kind of been trying to illustrate through these couple of images, really, is that media themselves are not necessarily disruptive, that practices involving media can be highly disruptive. And this is the students' practices with technology is something I started to look at, I guess, around about 2007-08 with a program funded by the GIST called Learners' Experiences of E-Learning. And the focus then very much was on how learners experienced the institutional context. So e-learning was something institutions did to learners. They had systems, learners had to learn to use them, and what was that like for learners? And that was kind of very much the focus of the work we were doing. And come forward a few years, and I worked on a project called Learning Literacies for the Digital Age, because partly coming out of that first bit of work, we'd realised that learners have all sorts of digital practices that are nothing to do with the institution, nothing to do with the institutional framing of their lives, but actually to do with how they might collaborate, how they might find information. This is sort of about 2009, so I guess Wikipedia panic was probably at its height. And I became quite interested in how learners transpose, or more often fail to transpose, actually their digital skills and expertise into the teaching and learning context. How do they make use of those forms of access, those kind of facilities that Adrian was saying so quite rightly, the things that they have at their fingertips, and why do they often fail to do that, or why do we often fail to help them to do that effectively? And scroll to the present day, and the work that I was introduced around the Digital Student Project has been looking at the experiences of what we now unashamedly call digital students, and how they experience the technologies and practices of the institution. And in the space of 6 or 7 years, the lens has been turned around completely. So we started off saying, well, how do students experience our technologies, which in our generosity and bounty we are giving to them? And now we're saying, how do learners who have all this technology at their fingertips experience the technology which actually doesn't meet many of their needs very effectively at all? So we're thinking very much about the digital offer and how students who already have a lot of digital know-how make sense of that offer for their own learning. Okay, so at that interface between learners' digital practices and the practices we ask of them as students, as emerging professionals, or as emerging academics themselves, there is a lot of turbulence. And I think it could be called disruption, but I think turbulence is kind of a better word, because and that turbulence can be a really productive turbulence, because of course all learning involves disruption. We know from the insights of constructivism, we don't simply build new learning on top of the old. We quite often have to break down our old views of the world in order to create and construct something new. That is the key insight of constructivism. So anywhere there is turbulence can be a learning moment. And I think one of the things I was trying to say this morning is that learning technology has been a great force for creating turbulence around how we teach. It's not that technology makes teaching better, but technology creates conversations about how we teach, and maybe those conversations allow us to notice that ways we've taught in the past might not be necessarily the best ways. But there is turbulence and disruption at this interface, and old ideas being broken down, and I guess what Dewey called the audacity of the imagination. When I came into this space, this building this morning, that was the phrase that kind of came into my mind, the audacity to reimagine spaces in which learning takes place. It's got fake grass, it's got a hill, it's got loads of technology. I mean, I don't know what the collective noun, what's the collective noun for MacBook Airs, do you think? Because I think in this room there's an expense, thank you, an expense, a budget of MacBook Airs in this room. A barrel. Okay, so you could tweet this, but let's have a bit of feedback here. So I've suggested a few digital practices that I think are, that there may be turbulence, but give me some ideas about things that students do with technology that you think are potentially disruptive, whether that's got a positive or a negative sign on it. What do students do with technology that might be called disruptive, or from your point of view?
The one that keeps coming up is students using Facebook or YouTube in lecture theatres.
Okay, so students accessing Facebook, and presumably what people mean by that is for things utterly irrelevant to the, okay, good point, and that would be negative, disruptive in a negative way.
I don't necessarily think so. I think we need to, think about the fact that if perhaps, they aren't paying attention, then they weren't paying attention before then, it was distracting them, and B, learn how to link into those conversations and back channels.
Okay, I don't know if everyone heard that, but it was a really great point there from Gemma. So, if students have always been distracted, let's face it, and if they're being distracted and that distraction is taking them to the back channels of various kinds, can we encourage them to use those back channels more productively? Yeah?
One of the things I use in my teaching practice, I have to teach quite wide, people with very wide ranges of knowledge. And what I find, and I encourage in my classes, is that I'm able to touch a much wider group by encouraging them to think about various subjects, and then they'll go off on their pads and whatever, and actually hit it at the level that's meaningful for them, and even better, then start to share it. I think that's a hugely powerful part of the learning they can get.
But it's quite disruptive in, you clearly feel confident to do that, but it's disruptive of perhaps a very traditional idea of what the teacher does, which is to have all the know-how and absolutely, yeah.
International students using translation devices. At the beginning of the lecture, you suspect hearing about 10% of the lecture and translating 5 of the words from the beginning.
Right, that's not one I've come across. Is that something that's happened to you specifically? Okay, so that sound. People are kind of. It's interesting because I thought on a conference about disruptive learning, I'd be getting all this positivity, but we can be disruptive without it necessarily being a positive thing for learning, and we can be disruptive, and I think then creative around what that disruption might mean and how we could use it productively.
One of the spin examples internationals are actually photographing the slides, and so you're going on, but they're actually translating them, so they're able to keep up.
And some of that could be actually really helpful, but
So positively, they record the lecture.
yeah.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but we are streaming this and people are trying to listen to the questions as well.
Right, okay,
Mind if
so
we pass the mic round?
thank you. Yes, we must do that. Sorry. Well, where the mic goes, yes. So explain
Do
what's...
you want me to say that again?
Well, some of it, yes.
So the positively and negatively, students using translation software on their mobile phone in the middle of a teaching situation, which can be negatively disruptive, but positively that it enables them to record the whole session, listen to it as many times as they want. It's very, very positive for international students.
Yeah, so some universities are actually taking a positive step to let students control the recording of lectures and upload that. It's becoming much more normal that that's part of the systems provided by the university, but when it was a kind of early stage thing and students were just coming and plonking devices down, some forward-thinking academics said, well, hang on, if you're doing that anyway, upload it, share it, make it a positive thing. And I think, it's an example of how when students are coming up with their own solutions to problems they genuinely have, how do we creatively respond to that and make it a solution for everybody or for a larger number of students? And things that are good for international students are often actually good for everybody because they have particular issues with understanding and with translation, but lots of students also could benefit from captioning or kind of interpretation of slides. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about why I think students' digital practice could be disrupting some aspects of what we tend to think of as the traditional academic institution. And we've sort of touched on one of them, which is the means of digital production and digital sharing being in the hands of students, so having devices in their own hands, having laptops. That picture of students with laptops in front of them is a very, very typical one. So we've gone in the kind of last 10 years from talking about IT suites, places you go specially to do this stuff that the university provides for you, to bring your own device. It's all in the hands of learners. And that, when you bring your own device, you bring your own services, and to a large extent, you bring your own skills, because you're expected to be able to know what to do with them. The initiative that I kind of came into this whole field around was called Computers in Teaching, Now, how ancient does that sound now? 1998, computers in teaching was the initiative for educational technology. Nobody would use either of those terms now. Now we're interested in learners with their own devices, and the power has moved from the front of the room to the back of the room, and we're struggling with that. You know, we're struggling with what that means for us as people who perhaps have been used to owning the means of intellectual production. Classical academic is researcher, and they teach from their research, and those kind of means of producing new ideas and sharing them are very much were in the hands of the few. We've said that disruption always happened. Notes were passed around in class, students were distracted, students found their own workarounds for the things that didn't work for them. But it's constant, so the access to digital media is constant. I deliberately didn't choose the iWatch as my kind of intimate technology. I chose the Nike Fuel Band, and I think it was an interesting example because how many of you, now you have to confess, how many of you have some kind of device that collects data about your biological being, about your bodily, okay, yeah, you're counting, come on, how many of you are counting your steps and logging when you sleep? Okay, so it's probably about a third are confessing to that. So it's a very intimate technology, it's about our person, it's constantly on. It's, you know, our embodied life has a digital shadow. And this is true for students as well, so they can capture their physical learning situations and make them into a digital record, which they can review later. At the same time, any learning situation that they're in, that we're in, is porous, is leaky, is allowing in information and conversations from somewhere else. Even if learners are not doing that, the fact that that potential is there in the room changes the room. It changes the meaning of what I'm saying standing here, that you could all go and check up on it somewhere else. And in a minute, I'm going to give you a chance to go and do that. And it means that what we do here, it's being streamed, it's being recorded, people are tweeting. It has a life beyond and out of and after the event itself. So learners themselves, when they're in front of us, apparently learning and apparently engaged, are simultaneously somewhere else. You know, learners are simultaneously learning formally and informally. They're simultaneously here and there. They're simultaneously engaged and not engaged. So at this point, I am going to attempt, with this MacBook Air that I'm not very comfortable with, to bring another voice in. And what we were going to do was to encourage you to go and access this voice yourself. But what I'm going to do is just bring it in myself.
It's important to recognise that sometimes new software, new modes of engagement are just a kind of skin over old practices. And that's why, as learning institutions, we need to be really confident and say, it sort of doesn't matter how you're doing it or what you're doing it with, but we're about broadening worldview, we're about critical thinking, critical evaluation, moving forward knowledge. We're about, you know, helping you learn how to learn, helping you learn how to think. These are fundamental. These don't change. And what I wouldn't want us to be kind of promoting is the idea that we've got to run around like crazy people making sure we understand everything that's new. Because when you abstract what's going on pedagogically, and when you abstract what's going on epistemologically, essentially, quite often it's the same.
Yeah,
and
no, I would agree.
It saddens me when I see institutions lack confidence in the core of their mission, which can be expressed or facilitated through the digital, but which isn't the digital itself. So, for example, sometimes we get it the wrong way.
Okay, so you kind of get the idea that that was relevant to what we're talking about. But also I wanted to just show you the bringing in some other voices. And that was done really with very, very low tech. So I did that off Skype using Camtasia, which is a very easy-to-use piece of software that anyone can download. And, you know, to the horror of many people who know us both, images of me and Dave White talking about students' digital practices proliferate because the technology is so easy to use. But there's no reason why your learners, while they're listening to you, could not just as well be accessing other people talking just as expertly, if not more so, on the same issue. So there's the disruption kind of illustrated there. Okay, so we've talked about the leakiness of learning situations, of the capacity to bring other voices in. time has gone by much faster than I had imagined it would do, so I'm going to cut short what I'm going to say. But I do want to talk about media specifically as a specific aspect of students' digital practice that seems to me to be changing or to be changed. And this stamp, image-based, is on all of these slides because, as I said earlier, I think that it's the prevalence of the image. If we were to point to anything that has changed in the way the younger generation think about the world as compared to people of my age and older, that would be it. So students discover many ideas, many new and deep ideas in digital media, which are multi and hypersensory. So they engage more than one of their senses and experiences. Come on in. That they are immersive in some way and interactive. We all know, the Serious Games Institute has been at Coventry for some time, we all know of the huge explosion in kind of rhetoric around the value of games in learning. And I have to say that personally, I was somewhat sceptical because to me, I'm an English literature graduate, I think you can encounter the flattest of texts in an interactive, critical way. You know, a book with an index is an interactive document as far as I'm concerned. And also, as we know from the many scares in the Daily Mail that I'm sure we all subscribe to online, digital games can be consumed in a way that's incredibly passive, that is not essentially interactive or transformational or game-changing. However, I think that now that some of these production techniques are so accessible, even I can write an app. You know, Games Maker and Player App, someone was showing me some cards that you can use to gamify aspects of your teaching, for example. I think that game may be changing. So actually expressing your ideas through coding and through developing these kind of sensory immersive environments suddenly changes the game. If that's available as a tool, then we can, you know, students can do it. We're not simply presenting them with communication as a fait accompli. We're allowing them to take those tools into their own hands. Sometimes when one talks about those kinds of things to a mixed audience, the scientists all go, well, there's nothing in that for me, I'm going to switch off. So I always put in something about data, because I think some of the most exciting things that are happening in the communication of ideas are around data and data visualization. I did a session with some graduate students around data visualization that was kind of meant to be upping their game in terms of their research outputs, and they were all over it, and they all completely got the point and went off and created all kinds of amazing things from open data. So the thing about things, and I would encourage, the next slide will give you a link to various things you can go and look at with data, that are data visualizations, but I think that I might try and get up the tag cloud if we've got time. The tag cloud for this event is a visualization of raw data, and it's real time, and it involves you. You're in it somewhere. If you've tweeted anything, you're in that data visualization. But also those kind of visualizations, they can often be localizable, so they can be map-based. You know, they can allow you to understand your own community better. You can collect open data that's freely available about your community, about yourself. Really savvy learners that I've worked with want their own learning data that's being captured by the institution from the virtual learning environment or the learning record. They want access to it because they want to know, they want to be able to use their own visualization tools to see how they're doing, you know, to see how their grades are progressing or failing to progress, to see where they need to put in more effort. So learners are very savvy about data-based media, the good ones, and the ones that aren't, they need to be, because if you're not using data, it's using you, basically. So it comes back to the responsibilities we have for our learners' digital literacy. So I won't encourage you to go necessarily now, but I've made some short URLs for most of the stuff that I'm showing you. So if you go to bit.ly disrupts 1, 2, and 3, you'll get some quite nice database stuff that you can play with if you're interested too. So something I do want to take you to see, though, and I don't know how long we've got before questions, is an animation that was made by one of the graduate students I worked with a couple of years ago. The students had worked with me over a course of a term to basically become digital champions in the university and to develop their digital skills and their kind of ability to work on change-based projects. And I asked them to do an account of their learning journey, and I gave them complete free rein as to how they might do that. I thought some of them might capture video. And to my surprise, an awful lot of them went and created animations. It must have been a thing to do a couple of years ago, something that I couldn't have imagined doing. But this the task wasn't to create an animation. The task was to describe your learning journey. And this student called Diana produced a really lovely animation, which I will show you a little bit of.
Come on now, don't be shy. What have you got there? How fantastic, I've been waiting for this. My name is Diana. This is my learning journey as an intern in the Cascade project at the University of Exeter. Running under an auspicious digital sun at the University of Exeter, the project aims to incorporate more digital skills in teaching and research, and is supported by a wonderful team of people and interns. And of them, if you look all the way down the bottom, as you might expect, the protagonist of this story is me. And as you can see, I have quite a lot of bricks in my boat, and if we look really carefully at them, we will see that these are actually the building blocks that I've been bringing into the project. My previous experience with online data.
Okay, so if this is a kind of natural way that our learners have of sharing ideas, then, you know, how disruptive is that in fact for us? So if our learners are using image-based, animation-based representations, not just to demonstrate what they've learned, but actually to learn with, actually to create new representations of ideas in their learning, how disruptive is this, and how disruptive does it have to be? I mean, I'd take some thoughts about that. How do we go about assessing, for example, since that's been a theme of several sessions, how do we go about assessing things that are produced in media that we perhaps are not ourselves competent to produce?
I don't know if you have to assess that. Oh, sorry. Wait for the mic. I've done a few projects now where we've used getting the students to create products, digital artifacts to help their learning. And that's something we've always ended up with is, at the moment, I'm working with some school kids who are making comics of their favourite books and then showing them to other schools through video conferencing and things. And the answer is, I think you don't measure the quality of the artifacts themselves, because that's ultimately not what you want the students to learn. Okay, they want to learn the technology because they've got to be able to use it to do the stuff. But what you really want to know is, what have they learnt about the books? Or, if we've done key skills here, then it's what have they learnt about key skills? And so you really have to kind of disengage those two things. We're not teaching them to be artists or designers. We're teaching them to love literature or whatever. And so that's what you measure. You measure how well they've learnt or how their perspectives have changed through creating the artifacts. But we're not really interested in how good the things are that they've produced, really.
Thank you. That's really, I mean, I would counter that with sometimes we are. Sometimes we are interested, but I think that's right. So we have to be confident, though, then, that we can apply academic criteria of judgment about the depth of learning, about the quality of learning, to media that we might not be that familiar with using to express academic or professional or vocational ideas in.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. My name's Ian Upton. It's really just a comment rather than a response. On your diagram, you had a computer, blah, blah, and it went all up to the mobile telephone. I'd add something else on the end of that, which is the cloud. And if we add the cloud there and we start to have a personal cloud, that's our new space. In then response to the question we just had, if we see this as our new modern day digital pencil and the apps that are on it that enable me to do stuff in those spaces, then in effect, education, all that's exactly the same as we used to do with pen and paper. It's just a different way of doing it. I take Mark's point completely. We're very, very media savvy. So when we see things on screens and stuff, we're bringing to bear huge production values and can sometimes miss the thought involved, which is what the education is about. But I think also, if we see these as digital pencils and the cloud as our new digital paper, then actually we are going to discover new ways of learning, thinking, and whatever's.
Yes.
That's the point.
Thank you for that. I mean, what I slightly feared you were going to say was it's just the same. And actually, I think you're not saying that, which is great, because I do think there is an awful lot of this which is what I would call transactional. It is simply about how we get ideas, notes, stuff from place to place for students to organise their learning with. And an awful lot of what universities worry about is that transactional stuff. How do students know where to be when? Do they have access to the calendar? How do they get the learning content? How do they upload their assessments? A lot of it is simple. It's not simple. I don't have to make this thing work, okay? So I can say that's simply transactional. But I think you're right that there is a point at which those transactional changes become transformational. They change what it means to learn, what it means to know, what it means to be an effective, capable, expert person, citizen, worker, person in their life. So just for the last little bit, I just want to point up some places where I think that that turbulence is pointed, and we, you know, rather than simply saying, well, it's all good, let's have it all, we might actually have some more difficult decisions to make. So clearly, and I'm going to ask you to choose in a minute, I'm going to ask you to make a choice. I might even ask you to move from side to side of the room, so you've got to pay attention. You see, that's a technique from the old school, isn't it? I'm going to ask you to do something, so pay attention. So we know that students bring into this space of study lots of their personal habits with technology. And, you know, some of them are up there. And a lot of this is a good thing. But where is it, you know, a little bit more troubling? So I've done quite a lot of work with students to talk about, ask them about how in practice they go about finding information that is credible, that they can get a good grade with. I don't care how they find information. I want to know, how do they find academically credible information that they think the tutors want them to have? And the stories are always really complicated and strategic. So of course they use Google and Wikipedia, and they use all these things that, you know, certainly until recently they were told not to use, and they ask their friends, and, you know. But then they kind of dress it up with the stuff they're supposed to do. And some of that is really clever. I mean, stuff that I would do, frankly. I would look at the end of a Wikipedia article for the real references, and I'd go and look them up and see if they're actually what they're meant to be, and I'd put them in an essay. Or I might go to a Wikipedia page and look at the history of it and see who's commenting on this page and say, oh, that's somebody I need to talk to. Some of that is really quite clever stuff. But some of it is tactical rather than strategic. It's surface. Okay, so they know how to pass, but they don't necessarily know why we have some of these traditions about, for example, acknowledging other people's work. They don't necessarily know why that should be, or how to use those tactics that they've evolved to build a personal view, in the cloud if necessary, of their field of study. They don't necessarily know that, and we're not helping them to. Another piece of work I did with one of those wonderful graduate students I worked with was thinking about how writing was changing in the digital university. And, you know, how students write is very different from how certainly I was told to write an academic essay. Write your structure, take some notes, do some research, write up your notes, you know, begin with the introduction. No, they don't do that. They start with what they feel confident about. They write patches around things that they feel comfortable and confident about. They extend those patches out, they build them, they link them together. They look for apps that can help them, to Evernote, you know, so it's a curational, it's a curatorial approach to writing. It's not a structural and then a narrative approach, which we were always told to do. Now, frankly, I don't think any of us write in that way, certainly anymore. I don't know many people who do. There may be someone studying ancient Greek who still does, but, you know, most of us use these curatorial approaches to our academic writing, even when we're writing for journals. And people are nodding, you know, I say this and people go, oh, yeah, confession time, guys, we do that thing. But, you know, we do it with some of the tools of the trade behind us, so we know how to think intensively and extensively about an idea. We know what it means when we say original, critical, and voice and audience, and not always communicating that with our students. You know, and the last example I would use, and this is the one I'm going to ask you to make a choice about, that's something that I very regularly use as a good way of bridging students into, first-year students often, into academic ways of thinking and sharing ideas, is social bookmarking. I've done it really successfully with social workers, with nurses, with historians. You know, the subject doesn't matter, but it's something they get from their social digital use. You share knowledge and you acknowledge where it came from. I liked that. I'm going to share it with you, and here's where it came from. Those kind of values of acknowledging, reference tagging, for example, are well established, and you can use those established norms and then push them into a more academic space. So, okay, why do we acknowledge people who've thought of things before us? How do we tag this so we can find it later? And those kind of practices can then become more about the academic experience, which they don't always understand. Thank you, that's right. So in 5 minutes I'm going to go to questions, but before then, so I think that raises those conflicts, that turbulence between personal practice and academic practice, which I've kind of suggested has a tension in it. There's a tension, isn't there, between the kind of established academic norms, practices, and the digital norms and practices. We could do two things with that, and one is what I just suggested that I do, which is to find bridges across from the digital practice to a more academic practice. So find the bridge across from having a Facebook page to having a LinkedIn profile, which I manage actively. Find the bridge across from social referencing to using the Harvard system, perhaps using something like Zotero or Evernote, doesn't matter which, but or EndNote, doesn't matter which. Or we could say, hang on a minute, in 10, 20 years' time, is anyone going to be using the Harvard system? Yeah? should we radically rethink what it means to reference? Perhaps a web link is actually better than a Harvard reference, because it actually goes to the place. It takes the person to the place. They don't have to go and look it up somewhere else. It takes the person to the place where this knowledge was. So much of what is academically credible is already available online. Why are we saying to students, I'm sounding like I believe this now and I don't, but anyway, why are we saying to students, you should write a reference and you should put that in your essay, and then if someone else wants to go there, they have to take that reference away and find it? Why don't we say, put in a web link? That's fine. It's better. It's actually better. That's an example, okay? You might fall different ways with different examples, but the question behind that example is, how far do we radically rethink what it means to know something and to study and to be a knowledgeable person, and take those digital practices into our academic practice and allow them to disrupt it from top to bottom? And how far do we say, actually, some of the things we do in this fusty old institution with books on the walls still are really valuable, and we want you to use your digital practices as bridges into those really valuable practices that we're not prepared to give up. And I'm going to make you choose now between whether we should use digital practices as bridges into traditional academic practices or professional, if you're teaching professional, and how far we should allow our students' practices to radically disrupt and constantly change what we think is a way that we know and practice. I think because you're all looking a bit sleepy, I'm going to make you move around. Okay, so go over there if you think that, and go over there if you think that, radically rethink. And if you're hovering in the middle, then you're just going to have some conversations till you can make your mind up. And I'm going to ask you. In total? Okay, well, I'll take the questions from the two sides. Brilliant. Have we got the mic? Yeah, okay. Okay. I'm going to go over here, okay? I'm going to be a Luddite over here. So are you people here, just, do you not know, or do you have a really subtle point you need to make?
I think you can do both.
Okay, say more.
Well, I think you have to understand what serious academic work is if you want to be an academic, and if you're serious about pushing knowledge forward. But you have to be able to think in an agile way in order to communicate what you're thinking. It's no good us having books if people don't understand how to use them, don't like to use them, or don't know how to use them, or find them even. But also, you have to be able to push that out into the world so that you can draw people in. More people in, if you see what I mean. Yeah. It sounds a bit confused, but...
I like both and, but I want to go with some people to have a really extreme view here. So does anyone over there think books are out? We won't have any books in 10 years' time. Go on, Mark.
Well, but just don't start with burning my books. Actually, we were kind of sitting ourselves the more extreme, the further away. So Gemma's probably the more extreme. So should we start with Gemma?
No, Mark. I'm starting with you.
Oh, okay. I think, the arborescent rhizome kind of metaphor of the rhizome one is that information builds up by small connections and more connections and so on. It's Dave Cormier and all that group. And then I think the arborescent one is as a core set of, which all branches out, but there's key texts. And I don't think that's the way that knowledge really is organised. I mean, when I was putting my thesis together, I would use blogs. I would go from the blogs to the things they'd referenced. I'd gradually build it up from small patches here and small patches there, and then gradually build something between them. And I think what I was trying to do with that was reflect the new technology and the new ways of thinking when I was creating it, as much as to get away from that kind of older academic and maybe traditional way of seeing what knowledge is. And I passed, so it wasn't that big a risk. But I think that's the way that actually that's the way knowledge is. That's actually how it works. And I think if we can map academia to the way that reality actually works as far as knowledge goes, then I think we've probably made an improvement there. And I think probably the academic professional practices that are embedded aren't that able at representing what real knowledge is, that actual valuable stuff can be in a blog, it can be on a TV show, it can be anywhere, and it doesn't have to be in those paper journals that sit on a shelf in the library somewhere.
But don't we as academics have a particular set of not just processes but values around how we behave towards knowledge that have given us, I mean, it's not just that they're reified particularly on paper, but things like peer review, for example, one could argue have a very long and illustrious history around sorting the wheat from the chaff, of challenging, of putting people in the viva, your ideas get challenged in a particular institution, verbally actually, and there's not been any substitute for the viva as far as I'm aware of it. So although clearly academic knowledge can exist in all these different forms, do we not have certain ways of approaching that knowledge which are still kind of culturally embedded? Can we come to some people over here who've got a different view? We might need a mic.
Hi, I'm probably coming at it from the view of I'm subject librarian, so really appreciate the value of the books, the value of the information, the evaluation of the quality of information. But I'm also aware of the reason I've kind of remained on this side was because at this moment in time, I'm more in favour of using the bridge approach and gradually moving over, whereas I can see at some stage we will get to a stage where we perhaps need to radically rethink, and perhaps when it's become, that's a bit of a contradiction in terms, but I don't think we're ready for the radical yet.
Well, it's a bit like I was saying earlier, that very disruptive practices can come with quite well embedded technologies, and actually they often do, because sometimes the practices with brand new technologies are just a little bit of what Dave on my film was the running around responding to everything because it's new, aren't they? Whereas when something is well used and well embedded, that might be the point at which you kind of go, well, actually, I can see how we can completely turn learning and teaching on its head with this. I'll come back to you if I don't have anyone else who wants to talk, because I want to get a few more voices in. Was that a
yeah,
in the middle?
Shall I wait?
Or shout?
I could shout, yeah.
Shout while you're waiting.
I'm just wondering how subject specific this is, because in arts and humanities, maybe, and I'm not being horrible here, but maybe it's less important what the knowledge is as opposed to science and engineering, because you wouldn't want somebody building a bridge if they didn't get because the equation that they chose was from somebody's blog and they'd made a mistake and in changing from one set of units to another, as opposed to somebody's opinion about I don't know, Caesar's wars or whatever you have, or somebody's opinion on Jane Eyre. Everybody has valid opinions on art and literature, but science, engineering, medicine, you need that peer review. You need people to say, this is our agreed set of, and we've tested it, and we know it's right.
You're not making yourself many friends in this room. I'm just going to mention that at this point. But I think you... Yeah, go on, finish.
I see, because I see both sides.
Yeah,
I'm an engineer who also I write. And
some of your best friends are not engineers. I believe you. I really do.
I think that's sort of where I'm coming from. I see the two sides.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think that one, I absolutely agree about the disciplinarity. And one of the things that might be most resistant to some of these disruptions are disciplinary boundaries. Because it's not only about how funding gets allocated, frankly, but it's also about very rigid cultural norms about what it is to know and what it is to know validly and what it is to come to know validly. And that's precisely why I included the data as an example, because I do think in science, technology, engineering subjects, what it means to know validly is changing and being challenged. The whole open data movement, which has been massively taken up in a whole range of hard scientific subjects, goes completely counter to all the traditions of not just research funding but research publishing, which is that what you publish is your findings and they're yours and the data was yours. Now, the pressure from funders is you publish your data so somebody else can iterate it. Yeah, exactly.
You do end up with a more open...
Absolutely. But my point being, the meaning of what it is to know is changing because of that. Yeah. So it's not just us fluffy social scientists who might go and just talk about opinions, which is what we do, really, isn't it, guys? But actually, there may be that the disciplines are what are kind of holding everything together. But the thing about that is, interestingly, that a lot of the most interesting disruptions happen at the boundaries between disciplines, don't they? Which is one of the things this centre is doing. I've got to shut up, haven't I? Have we got one more question? Thank you for that. I was teasing you because you were digging your own hole over there as an engineer, but it was great to have that. Yeah. You've sat on the radical side. Gemma, and then this guy will. Yes.
Hi. I've kind of sat myself right at the very top of the radical thinking, because I think we do need to rethink the norms and assumptions that come with academic practices. And you use peer review as an example, and I think that's a really good one. But we also know that there is a history of sexism in peer review, that women's publications are received and reviewed very differently than men's, for example. So whilst I think we need to be kind of aware, we need to bridge towards changes, we also need to radically rethink what our established practices say about our society and our culture, and the fact that they have sustained for so long over time, but they have been sustained in very structured and in some ways problematic ways.
Thank you, Gemma, for that. We didn't have time for it, but actually one of the things I was going to go on to talk about, had there been time, was precisely how some of those structural inequalities get reproduced in online spaces. So I don't think the digital, it may be an opportunity to have the conversation, but I don't think the digital in and of itself disrupts most of those structural inequalities. Yeah, I agree. Have we got time for one more, or have we got to go? Okay. Sorry.
I'd just like to say thank you very much to Helen.
Thank you.